Welcome to CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Coming up, an alarming number of pastors seriously considering leaving ministry. We'll bring you the latest in a new report. Plus, an atheist group working to stop a public schools project for kids called Operation Christmas Child, even though it helps children around the world. And why one expert is so concerned about the idea of a U.S. consulate for the Palestinians in Jerusalem.
They probably should consider an alternative to what they are considering now, given that it would very likely topple the current Israeli government.
We'll hear more about why the U.S. and Israel are divided over this plan. Plus, they built a replica of Noah's Ark. Now they're rebuilding the Tower of Babel. So why are they doing it? We'll have that story and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin with a shocking percentage of American pastors seriously thinking about leaving the ministry. CBN News correspondent Brody Carter is following newly released numbers and spoke with church leaders on how to navigate this difficult season. Brody.
Mark, the latest casualty in this great resignation are pastors. In fact, 2 out of 5 pastors are seriously considering leaving full-time ministry. That shock felt across the globe from COVID-19 has created a sense of longing for both Christians and secular society. New data released today from Barna Research shows a 9% increase since January in the number of pastors thinking about leaving. October numbers reveal 38% of church leaders are saying they were close to quitting. In addition, 1/3 of Christians stopped going to church altogether during and after the pandemic, and this comes after another record-breaking 4 million people quit their jobs in September. Now, the reasons why pastors want to quit range from pandemic-related stressors and conflict within and outside the church. A leading pastor from North Carolina says this season of suffering is a great opportunity for the church to stand up and be a support to those who feed our spiritual lives.
When the book of Acts, when affliction came, the church really exploded, right? So just because we're in a pandemic and just because we're experiencing what we're experiencing from a political standpoint throughout our country does not necessarily mean that the church is not going to advance.
Dr. Bond says support starts with our church elders, creating a buffer around our pastors to support the health and the pastors whose families come second, creating healthy spaces for these pastors to vent and be vulnerable without fear of remediation. You can hear the full story tonight. It'll be on Faith Nation. It airs at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Mark, back to you.
All right, Brody, thank you for that report. There is a major shortage of staff in schools across the nation. Staff members are taking on different jobs to fill in the gap of not having enough workers. One major concern is the lack of teachers. Now, many schools are temporarily going back to remote learning, and other schools canceled classes in recent days. Reasons for the shortages include fatigue following the COVID lockdown in 2020 and teachers facing issues with students having learning loss and mental health matters. Schools not only face a staff shortage within the school buildings, but also school bus drivers are harder to find. It's a problem that existed before COVID-19, but has only gotten worse. Charlene Aaron has more on what districts are offering to lure drivers behind the wheel.
Like many districts across the country, Chesapeake, Virginia is getting creative in trying to fill the driver gap, including recruiting teachers to transport students before and after class.
Our HR department recently sent something out division-wide, and not just teachers, but any school system employee, be it a teacher, a custodian, a security monitor, a teacher assistant.
Dr. David Benson is Director of Transportation for Chesapeake Public Schools. He normally employs 477 full-time school bus drivers and now faces an unprecedented 131 vacancies.
That impacts us tremendously because each of those drivers, we're on a tiered system, actually complete 2 and 3 tiers for every route in the morning and the afternoon. And each tier can have up to 50 kids or maybe even more on each run. So every time a single driver is out, it could impact as many as 150 kids in the morning and 150 kids in the afternoon.
While shortages happen from time to time, this one has increased substantially since the start of COVID. According to a school ride service survey, about 81% of school districts nationwide have trouble finding bus drivers. 87% see the driver shortage as a major problem, and 70% believe it's only getting worse. Benson says this affects multiple areas, including students, drivers, and parents.
The drivers that we have will complete their route, and then they have to double back and get another group of kids. They're getting to school late, and it's because of the time that it takes us to do double runs.
Reasons for the lack of drivers include the need for better pay and concerns surrounding COVID-19. Many are over 65 with pre-existing conditions, putting them at greater risk for the virus. Given that, many districts now offer better salary and benefits, along with other incentives.
We currently have a $250 signing bonus for employees that come in. If you have a CDL, we have a $500 signing bonus. We have incentives for our drivers who maybe have young children. We allow them to bring their children that are between the ages of 1 and school age with them to work so that they don't have childcare costs. And then obviously the one that we had talked about, we continue to offer benefits for employees that are only working an average of 25 hours are getting full-time benefits, which is kind of unheard of in the public sector.
So far, no Chesapeake teachers have accepted the offer to get in the driver's seat. Although Benson remains hopeful, other applicants will soon come aboard.
We still hope that it's going to happen, and we're going to continue to do everything we can do until it does. But we also understand it creates quite a burden for our parents and the students, and it's impacting the academics.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Turning now to international affairs and the U.S. relationship with China. President Biden and China's Xi Jinping wanted to reduce simmering tensions in a 3-hour virtual meeting last night. Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, and human rights were among the topics discussed. On the hot-button issue of Taiwan, Biden emphasized that the U.S. remains committed to a one-China policy. He also said the U.S. strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo, a signal that Beijing should not attempt to take the island by force. Xi referred to the American president as an old friend and said the U.S. and China should respect each other and coexist in peace. Here are some other stories we're following for you in the CBN newsroom. The United States is blasting Russia for carrying out a, quote, dangerous and irresponsible missile test. The test obliterating one of Russia's own satellites and creating space debris that's threatening space travel and global commerce. Crew members on the International Space Station, including 4 Americans and 2 Russians, were forced to scramble into lifeboats for safety. The debris field also poses a danger to satellites that support phone and broadband service, weather forecasting, and global finance. Rising costs of labor, transportation, and grain are hitting many meat companies hard. As a result, Tyson Foods says it will hike up prices on their products. The company expects this to continue into 2022 to make up profit margins. Pastor Jamal Bryant of New Birth Baptist Church is calling on pastors from around the nation to join him to form a human prayer wall against racism and injustice this Thursday at the courthouse where the Ahmaud Arbery murder trial is taking place. This is Bryant's response to an attorney saying in court last week that, quote, "We don't want any more black pastors coming in here," unquote. Coming up, why an atheist group wants to stop a public school's Operation Christmas Child project, despite all it does for children around the world. We'll hear about that when we come back. Welcome back to NewsWatch. Every year, students, their families, and churches fill boxes for Operation Christmas Child. The project helps children around the world. But now an atheist group wants to keep at least one school from participating. FaithWire's Billy Hallowell joins us now with the story. Billy, why is an atheist group targeting Operation Christmas Child?
You know, this is sort of an annual tradition for the Freedom from Religion Foundation and some of these other organizations. They basically believe that it's a violation of the First Amendment for these schools to be participating. And in this case, you had a Texas school, part of the Galena Park Independent School District, that was taking part. And so they fired off a letter last month, basically strongly encouraging them to no longer participate in Operation Christmas Child.
Parents opposing what happened here?
Well, that's what's really interesting. So far, it's been very quiet. Even the school district hasn't said much. They had initially posted an image of the kids basically helping collect money for Operation Christmas Child. We have no idea how many years they were participating in this, but those images can no longer be found. And that was right after they fired off the initial letter. You see, the thing with these cases is that many of the school districts, they get really frightened because it's expensive to go to court, to fight the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So a lot of them just back off entirely.
Well, Billy, legally, if it's a voluntary student-led project, why would the school board stop it?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing here. I think the fear I just mentioned generally is what drives this, because you have a situation where a powerful legal organization, remember the Freedom from Religion Foundation, they have staff attorneys. They have people who are working with them to send these letters off. And many times they just send a letter and they make a request. Other times these letters are more strongly worded. And when you do have the intermingling sometimes of, faith coming into the public schools, it's a very sensitive topic. And these districts become afraid. Even if they were to win a case, the cost to go to court to deal with that back and forth, it's often easier to just say, okay, we're not going to participate. And so you'll often see school districts and towns do that in these cases, even in cases where they think they could win, simply because they don't want to spend taxpayer money on fighting the actual battle itself.
We have done several stories on the Freedom from Religion Foundation. What can you tell us about that organization? Again, it's the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and what people can do if they find themselves on the receiving end of this group's protest.
So they are based out in Madison, Wisconsin. They are a national group. They have chapters all over the country, and I believe they have about 33,000 members. So it's a fairly large organization. They're devoted to the separation of church and state. And so that will manifest itself in all sorts of different arguments. You will see, this is Texas, right? We've seen cases all over the country where they have gotten involved. And their goal, again, is to separate church and state. But oftentimes it will feel like there are certain cases where you'll say, but is that really a violation? Now, we don't know all the details of what the school district was doing here in terms of Operation Christmas Child, but we know that this is a wonderful project. And I will say, to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's credit in this case, they said, it's a great cause to help children in need, but we want you to do it with a secular organization. So I have often found, covering them now for over a decade, that one of the hard things I think for believers is you're looking at a solution in culture, right? You know what the solution is. You're watching culture go a different way. And everybody at these types of organizations, they're pushing against the one solution we know will help and will work. And so that's what you'll notice in most of these cases, that it really is about removing God from any sort of public arena. And by public, I mean government arena.
So quickly, Billy, we're almost out of time, but where do things stand now? I mean, is basically the Operation Christmas Child at this school going to be stopped?
Yeah, so from what we know, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is claiming victory. They put out a second press release the other day saying that they were assured by the school district that they would no longer participate. They would no longer collect money for Operation Christmas Child. So as far as we know, that is where it stands. We're going to do a little more digging and try to find out. But my sense is usually in these cases, the school district will remain quiet because they don't want to drum up a bigger situation and spark a response from frustrated parents.
All right, Billy Hallowell with faithwire.com. Thank you so much, Billy, for staying on top of this story for us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Still ahead, why the Biden administration wants a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem and why Israeli leaders don't. You're watching NewsWatch. Israel has turned down a Biden administration request to open a U.S. consulate in Jerusalem exclusively for Palestinians. Author Jonathan Schanzer, Vice President of Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, told CBN's Gary Lane why Israel rejected the idea.
It truly does undercut the current American foreign policy, which is recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and treating Ramallah basically as the capital of the Palestinian Authority. They probably should consider an alternative to what they are considering now, given that it would very likely topple the current Israeli government.
Yes, I guess the Israeli government has said it'd be okay to have one in Ramallah, but not in Jerusalem. So You've just released this book about the recent Gaza war between Israel and Hamas. What didn't U.S. officials and the media get right about it? Give us an example.
Oh, there were just so many things. It was actually the reason why I wrote the book, whether it was the focus on a real estate dispute as the purported cause of the conflict, rather than Hamas looking to draw attention from its recent failure to engage in elections with the Palestinian people. That was probably the first one. There was terrible reporting about the Israeli decision, or actually it was more of a ruse, to not go in with boots on the ground to fight that war. You had a lot of people blaming Israel for a misinformation campaign. I don't think that was the case. And then beyond that, there were certain strikes that took place, specifically the large tower that Israel destroyed that we later learned had a Hamas office in it that was jamming Iron Dome, that very successful missile defense system that probably saved thousands of lives during the conflict. So really, one report after another was maddening. I watched the war take place in Hebrew. I watched it on Israeli television, and the reporting between what we saw here and what was reported there, it almost felt like they were covering two different conflicts.
Well, I was just going to say, it seemed like two different wars the way it was covered. Now, a senior Hamas leader, his name is Ghazi Hamad, says he won't rule out a new war. So how likely do you think another Gaza war is in the coming months?
Well, as I note in the book, I mean, Hamas likes to keep the region on a low flame. There is, I think, always the possibility, especially because Hamas is able to stockpile those very cheap rockets very quickly. They have their engineers that know how to do it. It's Iranian know-how, so they can easily replenish that arsenal, and so they can launch a war if they like. The question is really, how much will the Gaza people put up with it, and how much will the Israelis put up with it? I think the likelihood is we'll probably have to wait another several months to several years before the next conflict. I think that is a good thing, but Hamas can always hasten that if it chooses to, or perhaps more importantly, if Iran pushes them to.
Stockpiling missiles as time goes on. Beyond rockets and missiles is a political and economic war against Israel. You've spent a lot of time, I know, researching the anti-Israel boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, or BDS. You followed the money. So specifically, who's financing it and why?
Sure. Well, this was a study that we conducted several years ago, and it's still very relevant today. What we were trying to figure out is how it was that the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanctions activists, how they all were doing effectively the same thing, whether they were building these what they call apartheid walls on campus or posting eviction notices on the dorm room doors of Jewish students or pro-Israel students on campus. There seemed to be a commonality across a lot of these campuses. As we learned, there was one organization called American Muslims for Palestine. It's based out of Chicago, and they were doing a lot of the coordination of these activities. And it turns out that a lot of the people that work there had previously been involved in charities that were shut down by the U.S. government for Hamas-related activities. Now, we cannot say at all that AMP is involved itself in Hamas-related activities, although it was really important for us to conduct this network analysis to figure out who's doing it, what's motivating them, and perhaps just a glimpse at where some of the money comes from.
And Jonathan, it seems to be growing. How much of a threat does BDS pose to the Jewish state?
Well, I would say that thankfully so far it has a very minimal impact. Israel's known as the startup nation. It has a remarkable high-tech sector. If they succeed over the course of 5 or 10 years, we could see a negative impact. But thankfully, I think Israel is on top of it. And on top of that, I would say Israel is developing technology that the world needs, and that is protecting it from BDS probably more than any other measure could.
Okay, Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and author of the new book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Coming up, Answers in Genesis takes on building a replica of the biblical Tower of Babel. We'll tell you their purpose behind it with a real message for today's world right after this. Stay with us. Answers in Genesis, the ministry that created the extraordinary Ark encounter in northern Kentucky, has a new project. It's building a replica of the ancient Tower of Babel next to the Noah's Ark it built to the same specs God gave to Noah. The ministry quoted Genesis 11:4, showing what happened after the Ark and flood with the Tower of Babel. As he had done to Adam and Eve, the Lord blessed Noah and his family and instructed them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. While Noah's descendants multiplied, they refused to fill the earth. Instead, they decided to stick together and gathered in a place called Shinar. Refusing to scatter and desiring to make a name for themselves, they began to build a city and a tower with a top in the heavens. The Bible's Old Testament says the ancient tower was built by Noah's descendants after the worldwide flood. They rebelled against God and refused his command to fill the earth with their offspring. God confused their language to keep them from communicating about the rebellious plans, forcing them to eventually scatter and fill the earth. The purpose of the Babel project, the planners explain, is not to glorify that rebellion, but to glorify God and provide insight into issues confronting society today. At its heart, the tower planners say, is whether the biblical view of human beings prevails or the evolutionary theory does. They say on their website, our culture has been inundated by false views of our origins. And you can find more about this story at cbnnews.com. Sounds like a fascinating project there. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen, and you can do that by emailing newswatch@cbn.com or talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.
Download the CBN News app, 24/7 news from a Christian perspective at home or on the road. One place for all of your news. Breaking news alerts. Set daily prayer goals and pray for news stories. Read the most important news and watch CBN News Channel live. CBN News, because truth matters. Go to cbnnewsapp.com to get the app